Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're going to be talking about the 2024-2025 admissions cycle so far. And there are lots of people queuing in from the waiting room. And so while people are doing that, just a few housekeeping items. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please put them in the Q&A section, not the chat. We're going to monitor the Q&A and do our best to answer any questions that might not already have come up. We did take the questions that were submitted during registration, and that's what we're working off of. So if you submitted something, you'll likely hear it come up in our conversation. And we're also going to take a poll right at the top in a few moments to see for our audience what grade level people are so that we can adjust our responses given who is joining us this evening. I'm Bari Norman from Expert Admissions, and I'm going to hand this over now to Leslie Singer, who's moderating for us. And while Leslie gets started, I am going to put up the poll.
Okay, so, well, as Barry said, I'm Leslie Singer of Brown Harris Stevens, and I will be moderating this evening. And I have the pleasure of doing this with Dr. Bari Norman, who is the co-founder and head counselor of Expert Admissions, and Sasha DeWind, who is the executive director of Tutor Associates. Forgive me, we have many, many, many questions, so I will be looking down at that particular list. So once we're done with the poll and everybody kind of, is in, we will begin.
Yeah, so we have about 65% 11th graders, followed by a little under 20% 10th graders, and then kind of equally distributed for seniors, 9th graders, and then other. So we have a majority 11th graders, followed by 10th graders. So I'm going to close the poll. Thanks to everybody for responding for us.
So I'm going to begin, and I'm going to begin with a very broad question for Sasha. For this year, what has changed this year and what has stayed the same?
Well, thanks, Leslie. And I'm so happy to be here back with you both tonight. Well, unfortunately, my ACT is changing. And I think for anyone who's watched this before, I think of my ACT. My ACT is the steady test that never changes. And the SAT is always changing. But the ACT is indeed changing this year and certainly this spring. So I want to talk about sort of the three options right now for students and the differences between the tests. So we do have the SAT, and this is the new version of the SAT. It's been around for a little bit now. It's digital. It is testing the math and the verbal. It is adaptive. We can go into what that means in more detail, but this is the SAT as we've known it in its most recent iteration. That is available to our kids just as it has been, and in the same sort of timeline as it has been. And the only thing I want to note about the new SAT before I head to the ACT is that we have noticed some increased difficulty on the math section in the most recent SAT iterations. And the college Blue Book practice tests that the College Board releases, they've been updating their tests as we go. And this is what happens when you have a new test, right? They start to release more materials. The test changes a little. They release new materials. Our friends at Test Innovators, who make beautiful practice tests, I just got an email from them tonight saying we're adjusting our scoring a little. This is what happens when you don't have 20 years of data or 20 years of tests under your belt. But other than that, the format of the SAT is unchanged, certainly from last year. And we certainly have juniors and seniors who are done, but juniors and sophomores who are gearing up to take these SATs. So that's the SAT. Strangely, maybe my consistent friend tonight. But again, the math has been a little bit inconsistent, and that's been certainly a frustration for tutors and students alike. The ACT, in its attempt, I think, to compete with this new, shiny, shorter SAT, has decided it's going to also change. For our current juniors, for those 11th graders or their parents who are watching, realistically, the change doesn't happen until September. It can happen realistically for all intents and purposes. The new ACT is not until September. That's, means that you sort of have your old regular ACT with you all the way through September. And that's good news in the sense that in April, nothing's changing if you're a junior. There's nothing changing in June. There's nothing changing in July. But many of our juniors will want to test into the fall of senior year. That's a very normal thing to do. And unfortunately, by September of 2025, you will not have access to the current ACT if you're a junior. The good news is they're not changing it too much. They've shortened it a little bit, and they've given kids a little more time per question, which I know kids are going to love. So, the ACT has traditionally been a test where you just didn't have time to answer everything, and we think kids will feel a little less stressed for time. And they've made some things a little bit clearer on the English grammar section, which is nice. So all in all, not too many changes. I think the biggest change, and it's not a change for our kids, but is that they've made the science section as of September optional, and they are no longer including that dreaded science section in the composite, the average of the scores that goes to colleges. Now, certainly if you're a junior, you can just disregard that. The science is not optional for you. We have no idea, and Bari will speak to this more. We have no idea how colleges will react to the science being optional, but for now, we are staying the course. There are 4 sections: English, math, reading, and science. They can organize themselves however they want over at the ACT, but for us and for our kids, if you are a junior, you are taking that science section if you're testing in September, just as you would if you're testing in April. And for us, it is not optional, even if the scoring is going to look a little different on your score sheet. So just really quick recap: the ACT is changing in September. If you want to take it digitally, it's changing now, but we're sticking to paper tests. And that gives us a little bit of runway time. And if you're a 10th grader, yes, you are going to be looking at a new ACT and the SAT. But again, this new ACT is really just shortened a little, and by 10 minutes, it's not by a lot, and made a little bit more agreeable in certain ways. But we've looked at the content, it hasn't changed much. The structure certainly hasn't changed. And in that sense, it's still sort of predictable. Now, the one thing that always frustrates me is when these companies change the test, but do not provide students with adequate materials to practice with. That is more the case, frankly, with this new ACT than it has been with SAT in the past. They have one practice test online. It does not give you a scaled score, so it does not generate a score the way the practice tests do on the SAT. And it doesn't allow you to save. It doesn't save. So if something glitches on your computer, it's over. So we're pretty frustrated with the lack of materials. That being said, since the test is not changing nearly as dramatically as the SAT changed, it's not adaptive, they haven't done away with sections. Right now, juniors should feel comfortable, and sophomores too, frankly, practicing using older, slightly harder materials to practice for this new, slightly more agreeable test. So I know that's a lot of information, and I do have cute little graphs I can send anyone who wants to look it over. But that's the big news: is the ACT is changing. It's changing in September for all intents and purposes, and we're going to prep kids the way we always do.
So as a follow-up question, because we do have it then, how are we supposed to prepare for the ACT? If it keeps changing in this new, forthcoming, et cetera, are you going to say prepare as usual?
Yeah, so the ACT, of course, we've been in touch with them. It's interesting what my call list looks like, right? Calling the ACT and the College Board, but here I am. The ACT has said they will release more materials this spring. Our friends at Test Innovators, that's the company I mentioned earlier who does these does online and amazing tests, frankly. They're working hard on ACTs as well. So as the spring continues, we will have more materials that are updated. And remember, nothing's happening until September. So for now, it's business as usual for our juniors. Yes, in terms of long-term prep, we will be mixing old and new materials, and we will be adapting as materials are available. Remember, the most reliable materials always come from the company itself. I always trust a College Board test over a Kaplan test. I always trust an ACT test over a McGraw-Hill test. So we are going to use the materials we think are best suited to help kids practice. And and I will get into this more in this webinar, but the skills you need to ace the SAT or ACT, they haven't changed. The ability to recognize the patterns and the procedures and develop that set of skills hasn't changed. And the need to perform at a certain level under pressure, managing your anxiety and your fatigue and your hunger, because kids don't eat big enough breakfasts, all those things, none of that has changed. So even if the game shifts a little bit, how to play it doesn't shift much, and so prep doesn't shift much either. And I'll be honest, the thing we are most frustrated by is the lack of materials provided by the ACT.
Barry, how has the admissions changed this year compared to past years?
So, well, we obviously, with the changing ACT and recently SAT, we have to take that into consideration. Although, a lot of stuff can change and we have to pay attention to that when we're in the weeds or when students are in the weeds. But ultimately what matters is what admissions thinks about all this. And some of it they care about and even know about, and a lot of it they don't know about. And they're not paying attention to. So what happens on the two different sides of the desk, the student side and the admission side, can be a little bit different. So we certainly are paying attention to these changing exams and what we think will be best for our students to be able to get the scores that they need so that the scores don't become a barrier. And that's always what we're hoping for, right? You're hoping for scores that are not going to hold you back. And you're hoping to be able to provide scores that can put you in the sort of bucket of students that are going to be on the higher end for a particular school. So like Sasha was saying, depending if you're a 10th grader versus an 11th grader, you want to be thinking about this a bit differently. And I would definitely not just assume SAT or ACT, always try both. As far as other changes, I think that we've seen certainly, and by the way, we're in the midst, as most of you know, of the cycle. So, most of the early cycle, but not all, is complete, and we haven't even gotten the regular decision data yet. So we're in the midst, but of what we've seen so far, it's very clear that highly selective public schools are extraordinarily popular. Significant double-digit increases, 25% almost at University of Texas, about 12% in each of the EA and ED pools at University of Virginia. There's so many different examples, but these highly selective public schools are just seeing significant jumps in applications. And so that's something that's of note as of this year. One other thing that's been interesting is that we're seeing fewer highly selective schools. This goes more to the private schools, not releasing data, particularly at least at the beginning of this cycle. In the early stages, we'll see what happens if they release and what they release later, but keeping the figures a bit closer to the vest, although certainly the ones that are releasing, we're tracking that quite intensely. And the other thing I would say that we've seen from the early results is just that fit is more important than ever. So you can have the numbers, you can be in range, you can really want to go and see yourself at a particular place. But if you're not paying attention to what they want and the kinds of students that each school that you're applying to finds compelling, you're going to find yourself in a tough spot. So you really have to pay attention to fit, not necessarily, again, completely the way you might see it as a fit as a student, but thinking like the admissions officers on the other side at each of the schools.
And did you notice changes in the college admissions landscape, specifically among the most selective schools this year?
I mean, aside from the things that I've mentioned, no. I mean, I think for the most part, it always gets a little tighter. We saw a couple of places where there was a dip in the early applications. We'll see if what happens with the regular pool overall. But that's really just a couple of places. And, not really. I mean, it's still really hard. It's still really specific to each school and to each student. And I think the expectations are high, and each of them really is different. It doesn't mean you can't get into multiple. We have kids get into multiple all the time, but being of a certain level doesn't mean that you have sort of an equal chance at all of them. It doesn't mean that you have, that you should apply to all of them. And being strategic about where you apply and how you present yourself to each school is more important than ever, because these are continuing to be and will continue to be the most popular places, at least for high achieving students, not overall. They're certainly not receiving the most applications in total. But in terms of how nitpicky and how little flexibility they have, this is where people are looking.
You can both comment on this, but Barry, I'm going to ask you first. Are scores really optional at test optional schools?
So I'll give the answer to most admissions questions. It depends. It does depend on the school, though. It really, truly does. Some of them, you'll be fine either way. But at a lot of them, you're going to be much better served if you can give them scores they want. I always will take the scores and want the scores. That's my ideal situation, even in a test optional environment at a particular school, even where many students will be admitted via test optional. I always will find that the student is in a better position if we can give them scores that they want, not just giving them scores, but giving them competitive scores for their pool. You'll also find that it's easier to predict what will happen if you can give them scores. Again, I'll always pull the scores if I think it's going to be detrimental to a student's candidacy, and we can still have predictive ability there. But the more data you have, the easier it is to kind of figure out what's going to happen at each place. So I would say go for it. Don't take test optional as like an out. You treat it just as if they're required, as they always were. And probably on your list, you'll have a mix of schools for many students who are listening tonight. Not everybody, but many. But go into it saying, I need to take these tests. I need to do them as well as I possibly can. And I say that with no offense, Sasha, they're my least favorite part of the process. But you go in and this is the system, right? We don't get a say in what it is. We just have to help you navigate through it. So you go in with the attitude, I'm going to go in and take these tests and I'm going to do as well as I possibly can. And I really want to try to get as high a score as possible. And if you can't, the nice thing is that depending on where you're looking, most students will have a bit of a safety net with some schools. Actually, every student will, because from the Ivy League on down, there are test optional schools. Again, whether your chances are the same with and without scores is sort of another story.
And I don't want to speak to the admissions part. That really is Barry's world, but I do want to speak to how you approach this as a result of what Barry's saying, because when you come to a sophomore year, which is really the time to start exploring and diagnosing, and that does not mean it's time to start prepping. It does not mean you need to prep for 2 years, but 10th grade really is the time to start figuring out which tests you might take, start figuring out if you have accommodations, what the process is for receiving those. It's a planning time, right? And the reason I say that is because when you come to me in February of 11th grade or summer before senior year, and that's when you're sort of ready to get going, there may not be enough time for you to get the kinds of scores that Barry is going to say is worth sort of sending. And I think it's very important as a tutoring business to be honest and clear about how much improvement is likely, what kinds of work goes into that improvement. We never tell a family that they're going to go 14 points up in 3 months. It's just not going to happen, or it's very unlikely. And the reason I say this is because if your child really is going to improve a lot, but is likely not going to send scores, the other side of what Barry's saying is that we want scores. We want to be positioned that we have scores. The other side of that is if those are never going to get there, and it's going to take away from your valuable time that could be spent on your schoolwork, your extracurriculars, your sleep, other things like that. We want to be upfront and clear about that early on in the process so that we can plan ahead. So it's a balancing act, right? There's always an opportunity cost. We want all of our students to be able to reach that capacity and to be able to send scores. But we also want to start early so that we know what position we're in and we can plan ahead for all contingencies.
And we will advise students, like when we see diagnostic like scores sometimes, or when tutoring has been going on for a certain amount of time, we'll be like, and the tutoring and tutor associates will agree with us, just stop. Like, it's not worth it. Like, it's not going to get where it needs to get. And that's not doubting any particular student. It's just knowing the test, what's realistic in a certain amount of time, and what's worth prioritizing. So we too will advise certain students, just stop the prep even. And there'll be plenty of students who will use scores at some of their schools and not others. So it really, again, the answer always, right? It depends. It depends on your profile. It depends what your grades look like, right? Because that's a big part of, like, that sort of those two things taken together. It depends on where you think you might be shooting for. There's a lot of things that go into it, but it's not always the assumption that you're just going to prep until the end and just see if you can get where you're going to get. We would never put a student through that. For a variety of reasons, it wouldn't be worth it.
And too often, frankly, kids come to me in 9th grade, or their parents come to me in 9th grade or 10th, and they say to me, like, we're ready to get going. And when we start digging in, there's a B- in chem, there's a C+ in bio. And these are things that I think we need to address that right now, right? We need to help your child in their academics before we start putting our attention on something that actually, as Barry and I point out over and over, we have a lot of time to actually get to the test, right? The applications aren't due until 12th grade. And so of course, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about these tests, as we should. They are important and they're difficult and insufferable, as Barry points out. But the grades ultimately do come first, and they can't be redone. And parents should really be seeking out help early and often for those academic roadblocks, even in 9th grade, rather than focusing just on the test prep.
Also, kids start so early, they burn out right when they're ready to give us their best scores. I generally am very against the super early prep. I don't know that I have an example of it turning out particularly well. A lot of times you're just not ready. You have stuff to learn at school. You've got just developmentally further to go, and you'll get farther faster in less time overall if you start later. So just, I understand the logic on let's start as early as possible, because then it will be less stressful. We have more time to, for it to go on for, and to spread it out over. But it just, in theory, that sounds great, but in practice with actual students who are not robots and are juggling a lot, it just doesn't tend to work. So like Sasha said, we also say in 10th grade, we start considering which tests to take, getting ready to figure out which tutor you're working with and what, who you match up with well, when the initial testing schedule is going to look like, right? We don't just schedule the whole thing. We want to see how it's going, how tutoring is progressing. I think people are very quick to want to just say, I'm going to be doing this and I'm going to take it and I'll be done by this time. And I'm just going to put in all the time I can until then, so I'm done early. And it's like, well, maybe you'll be done early, but the results will be what tell us when you're done, right? And so just having some flexibility when you're starting, and also thinking that the end point is the beginning of 12th grade for testing. If you finish sooner than that, just consider yourself lucky and ahead of schedule. Do not consider it like you should be done at the end of junior year. And if you go farther, you're going late or longer. Admissions offices don't care and don't look at when you got your score. Like, you just need to get it. And the other thing is that we often see really nice jumps in the beginning of 12th grade, meaningful jumps. And I say that, like, jaded as I am of like what to expect with scores and what to get with them, really meaningful jumps at the beginning of 12th grade that make a difference between a student having a really good chance or being held back by scores. And so do not count out the beginning of 12th grade if you might need it. And it's not at all late. It's in fact like one of my favorite times for people to test because it gives me extra stuff to work with.
For those who don't know, how do you even decide whether you're an ACT or an SAT person to begin with?
Yeah, and I had a little question about this in the chat too, so I'll sort of go over it in more detail. I
Yeah.
mean, the very clear answer is to take a full length diagnostic in the SAT and a full length diagnostic of the ACT. Again, this usually happens sometime in the sort of winter, spring of 10th grade or the summer before 11th grade. Obviously, kids come to us all different points in the process, but really the best thing to do is to try one of each. You know, we've debated this a lot at TA. We are going to, right now for our current sophomores, until better materials are released, we are going to use the current ACT, the old ACT, as our benchmark. The new one that's been released does not generate scaled scores. It's just not accurate enough of a baseline, and the changes aren't dramatic enough for us to feel like the new one is worth using. So for now, you'll take an SAT and an ACT. Sometimes the scores are similar, sometimes they're not, but there's a lot of things that you dive into behind the scores that I'm always interested in, right? Why are the scores that way? Did you just run out of time? You know, what was the context of that diagnostic? I'm also interested in the timeline. I mean, some kids are away in July and there's a July ACT. And I love that July ACT, but if you're going to be in, you know, Paris, then that's going to be tricky. So we're also looking at things that are a little bit more zoomed in, not just the scores, but the why behind the scores and the logistics around it. And to Barry's point, I want to say that some kids have fall sports that are really intense. Some kids have nothing going on in the fall and their spring is crazy. So the timing of when you test, I mean, for at Tutor Associates, it's really customized around that child, right? There are children at boarding schools. They have a different life and a different amount of time to prep than kids who are at day schools. And there are kids who are ready earlier and kids who are not. And so there's no one size fits all. And I will say that the thing I did growing up, which is like spring of junior year, is when you test. We all just sat in May and June for the SAT. It's actually my least favorite time for kids to test. They're so stressed out. They're so tired. They're busy with finals. So actually, it's my least likely time to recommend testing. I'm happy with fall of junior year. If you're one of those kids who's ready way early, I'm happy with winter, spring of junior year. I'm happy with summer before senior year. And I'm very happy with fall of senior year. And yes, there are kids who test in the spring of junior year, but it's rare for me to really push that. And again, the ACT and SAT have different schedules, and those matter to me quite a bit when I'm looking at a kid's trajectory. So start with those two baseline tests, dig into them deeply with someone who understands what they mean, and then the plan can be put together. And again, we can put together a plan that doesn't start until August. It doesn't have to start right now. And this is also the moment where if you have accommodations on a test, if you have time and a half, I may be more likely to favor one test or another. If you have a particular type of kid, I may favor one or the other, but general baseline is try both, dig in deep, pick one, stick to it, never prep for both, and customize that timeline around your own child's needs, sports, life, readiness, etc.
As a follow-up, though, is there one or the other test that an Ivy League and top colleges might prefer?
No.
No.
Okay, then moving on, moving on. What is the difference between EA and ED?
This is also an easy, fast answer, actually, because I know we spent some time, lengthy time on the other ones. ED is early decision. It's a binding commitment. If they admit you, you must enroll. So you can only apply to one school early decision. There are multiple rounds of early decision at some schools. So in theory, somebody can apply to one school in the first round of early decision, not get in, and then apply to another school early decision in the second round, but that's only after they've been released from that first round commitment, and not every school offers it. So early decision is a binding agreement. If you're admitted, you must enroll. Early action, you're not obligated to enroll. If admitted, you have until May 1st to let them know if you're attending. In both cases, there's an early deadline. around November 1st-ish, give or take. And then also early response time where you get your decision on or around, I would say, I can't say a particular date because especially with the highly selective publics, it's gone so much, but I would say between mid-December and end of January, you will hear from your early action schools.
Sasha, does it matter how many times you take the ACT or SAT? And do you have to send all the scores, which both of you can answer this?
Yeah. So on the one hand, not really, right? You certainly can take this test multiple times, and I know there's lots of bragging rights among kids where they say one and done. And again, there's no need to be one and done. Although, as Bari said, count yourself lucky if you take it once and you're done. And I would say typically kids do take it 2 to 3 times. And there are kids who take it once, and there are kids who take it more than once. And the sort of short answer is you have a lot of control over what the colleges see. I'm not going to get too much into the weeds on that because there are some sort of exceptions about that, and Bari may want to speak to sort of how that works, and I can do that too. You do have a large degree of control over what you sort of send to schools and what they see. So in that sense, certainly you can send it more than once. And some schools and many schools, frankly, honor super scoring, which allows you to mix and match your best scores over multiple days. Though, again, I don't want to get too into the weeds, but they may or may not see all the different subset scores of those things. So you're still sending high scores, even if you're super scoring. But I guess the most important thing is, why are we taking it 4, 5, 6 times? Why would we be doing that, right? There's practice tests available where you get that feedback loop and you can practice and you can go through your answers, right? So there's no reason to use it as practice. And you shouldn't take a test you're not ready for. Psychologically, that's not great for teenagers. It's an early morning, it's high stress. And I think there are better ways our kids could be using their time, including taking practice tests that are simulated. So I'm sort of more thinking about why would we be taking it so many times, but certainly 2 times, 3 times is pretty typical for these kids. I like to say, let's say you're going for a 35, which everyone's going for on the ACT these days, because that's what Bari is going to tell you she wants to see, and I try to deliver. I might say something like, okay, let's do it in February and April of junior year. You're starting early, you're in good shape, you're going to be ready. And you know what? Maybe we'll land our 34 by April. Bari will start feeling a little more relaxed, right? We got our 34, but we're not at our 35, but we're feeling very good with a 34 junior
Plenty
year.
of time to get what
Got plenty of time. And I will say, great, you've done it twice. February was your first shot. Maybe you got your 32. You took it again in April. You got your 34. We're all feeling very happy. And then you're going to stop. You have to focus on school. You can't do the June one. You need to be working on your exams and then finishing off junior year. And then we have all summer. We have July, we have September, we even have October to come back to it and push for that extra point. So I would say that's just a very common scenario that I might find a kid in, right? Where it's kind of like they might do it twice and then go for that third, like 35 to make Bari really happy. But I don't want to leave, we're not sort of like starting the summer before senior year either, and then working our way through.
And by the way, like, even if you're not shooting for the 35, even if your ultimate score, you want to get a 30 or you want to get 32 or whatever, this all holds true. It's the same thing, is the idea of like, don't rush it. I agree with Sasha. Like, why in the world are you taking like the real test when you're not ready? Like, if you're not in the ballpark and it's not a potentially usable score or within striking distance. The other thing is the psychology of it. No matter what, like, students generally, if they log a real score, even though they know they don't, even if it's a case where the student where they wouldn't have to report it, students do feel for good reason that they have to dig out of it. And if that was a practice test, they would just say, oh, yeah, that practice test, I did this, I need to move forward. And the psychology, and for those who have been through this process know, the psychology of the process looms large over it. The psychology of it is so important, and it really plays out and impacts results and impacts your experience going through and the stress that you can avoid. And what most people want is to avoid the unnecessary stress. There will be natural stress in this process. This is one way where it's so much easier like it's so easy to avoid. And to, like a lot of things in college admissions, you can't apply typical logic to it. It doesn't operate on that plane. And so if you're going to apply normal logic to a process that, quite frankly, is illogical most of the time, or certainly very different than the way the rest of the world works, you're going to find yourself very frustrated and potentially on the wrong path to getting what you want. And so it's good to talk to your tutor or your college counselor and kind of figure out what's right for you, given where you are, what your strengths and weaknesses are, and where you're shooting, right? Where are you shooting for? All of that will give you the answer of what you need to do. And sometimes, you set something and then results come back and you adjust. You actually don't wait until the fall. We do take an earlier test, or we think you're going to take another test fairly soon and we realize, no, more prep. And then you go in and you'll get what you need. So everything is just so specific.
Barry, how would a school actually look at poor ninth grades, poor grades in ninth grade, if you will?
I mean, it does depend on the school, how much flexibility they're going to have. So the more selective the school, unfortunately, a bad ninth grade will and can knock you out. And it's not just like Ivy League schools. And at the same time, you can have what I would call a slower start or a slightly weaker ninth grade, and you can overcome that with an upward trajectory. I think most importantly, if you do have a slower ninth grade start, you want that upward trajectory where ninth grade looks like an anomaly. And then when you look at 10th and 11th and the beginning of 12th grade, you see a different pattern. It also depends what you got the grades in and how low are the grades, and and what are your interests and where were those lower grades earned. So again, a lot of particulars come into play, but if you had a slow start, try to set your sights on goals of just sort of trying to move in the right direction on the upward trajectory. And depending on where you're shooting for, you may or may not be able to kind of have that set aside. But they're looking at everything, right? They're looking at everything. They're taking things into account, whether you're in the early pool or the regular pool. Some instances it will make a difference there where they can be willing to be a bit more flexible and early, but if you show up in regular, not so much. And their strategy is going to be really important. And understanding fit is going to be really important. And those essays that you're writing for each school is going to be really important. So, we can overcome a bad grade, whether it's in ninth grade or 10th grade or 11th grade under certain circumstances. And at other times, they're going to hold us back. So it just really depends. But, consistency is key as soon as possible.
Let's say you have perfect scores, great activities. What's the most common reason why a stellar student who does impressive activities doesn't get into their college of their choice?
I would say that a lot of those students are indistinguishable from one another on paper. So, they're all smart enough to do the work. Nobody's questioning, are you smart enough? Which is why a lot of people, when they start trying to focus on things that make them look smarter, it's like, that's not really where we're going to spend our time. They'll decide if you're smart enough. They have their way of figuring that out. But I think very often those students aren't particularly compelling, right? Just being smart isn't necessarily compelling. Now, without certain grades and scores and rigor of curriculum, perhaps most importantly, you might not get a shot, right? That's door number one at every school. But having that, then you have to assume that about 80 to 85% of the students in any of these pools are going to be academically qualified. They're going to have the grades, the rigor, the scores. They'll be doing all the things, what they do versus what you do might be a bit different, but you're all doing interesting things according to your interests. The real question will come down to, and it's looked at through the essays. That's really the time that students get to speak in the process. Really the only time where it's evaluative that you get to speak. They're going to be assessing how compelling you are for their particular community. It's not really, decisions aren't made on like, can you do the work? Like that's whether or not you're part of the conversation. They make decisions on what are ultimately the softer factors, how you spend your time outside of school, what you got out of it, what you put into it, how it translated elsewhere. And most importantly, how do you communicate all of this through these essay questions that they ask you without it seeming super performative? Because once it seems like you're performing, you're done, right? So you got to kind of know what they want. You've got to speak in their language without them realizing that you're very intentionally doing that. And so I think a lot of students who are super smart are not particularly compelling. There's no reason to take them. And it really is, there is no, just because you're smart, actually, that's not going to be the reason you get in, not to these schools that are more selective, right? And so I think what you have to think about is sort of how do I put their thinking cap on, how they do things and they think about things. How do I make myself compelling to them? And what is compelling to whether you're comparing University of Texas to University of Michigan, whether you're comparing Harvard to Yale, I don't know, Emory to WashU, I don't care what you're comparing. It's all, whatever their peer institutions are that are all on your list. Not how are they similar to one another, but how are your schools different from one another, excuse me, and how do you fit in each of those spaces, and how can you communicate it in an authentic but not super performative way?
This is somewhat a follow-up in a way. How should kids spend their summers? How do you make a choice between a paying job as, let's say, a waiter or interning at a prestigious entity without pay?
So I think also, it depends on the student and it depends on what the opportunities are. So a lot of times I get the question of, well, it's a pay for play program and I just don't know. I know that that's not good. And the truth is that pretty much everything is pay for play. I mean, there are some things that you don't pay for, but pretty much all the opportunities that expose students to certain content and experiences have a paid component. There's no shame in that, and there's nothing wrong with that. The question is, what are you going to get out of it? What are you going to be able to put into it? How are you going to be able to take what you learned and apply it elsewhere? I think when students and families think about the program, and I did the program, so check, that's not the right way to be thinking about things. Yes, you took it or you did it, but that's not the end point. There never really is an end point. And so I think it's how you think about what you're doing, what you're going to get out of it. Like I said, what you're putting into it. Also, what are your other experiences? Like, what have you been exposed to and not? So one summer you have certain objectives, and then another summer you're going to have different objectives. And you're going to have different objectives based on what your overall profile is. You're going to also have different objectives based on where you're shooting. There are so many awesome opportunities that are programs, and I would run for them. I mean, they're fabulous. They give students the best experiences. That it's paid for, is not what we're really thinking about. And I think also, certain things are better at different points in high school. So I'm not as much a fan of classes per se as you get older. They can be useful and helpful for a variety of reasons in early summers, maybe before grade 9, before grade 10. After that, occasionally they make sense, but often they don't. Don't get obsessed with like what campus it's on, whether the college runs it themselves or not. We'll tell you if it's at a place where that might give you a little leg up at that particular school, but 99% of the time it's not. So you're going to do the thing that makes sense, overall for you. But what you decide to do really depends on your interests and the overall profile, where you're shooting, what you've done before, what you're going to do the next summer, because we plan and think about that, and then figure out the overall kind of roadmap.
And I just also wanted to say, and I think this goes to all of this, it goes to the grades, it goes to the extracurriculars, and I do high school admissions. I don't do anything with college, but I think as parents, and all three of us are parents, and I know that we're talking to parents, when your child is really passionate about something, when they really get things out of their experiences, whatever they may be, you can tell, right? As a parent, you can tell when they light up when they come home from something, versus when they're doing it to just kind of check a box or put it on a resume for college or for high school. And so, keeping that process alive in them, that curiosity for the things they're learning, that excitement for the things they love, encouraging them early and often to explore their passions, and then really to engage things that they truly love. When it comes time for Bari to help them with those essays, you can't turn a fake thing into something real. I mean, Bari probably could, honestly, but you can't, right? Bari's a little magician, but when Bari sees passion in a child, when I talk to the juniors who are testing and I feel their excitement about things and who they are, even if they have no idea how to write a college essay, it is much easier for Bari or for me when I'm talking to them about the SATs to channel those things when it's really there. And so as parents, focusing less on the like, what are the things they'll like, and more on developing that child over 4 very important years of their life, into someone who's curious and happy and engaged and loves the things they do. That's what Bari's talking about when she says, well, what did they get out of it? Right? What did they take away from it?
Yeah,
And
a
I think
lot
that's true of being a waiter too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people will ask, well, what am I supposed to say? And it's like, well, I can't tell you why you like something, right? I can't tell you, you can't fake joy. And by the way, there are students who have passions, and maybe, certainly many, maybe most of them do not. And that is okay. And that's where we can work with it too. But we absolutely expect them to like certain things more than others. So I don't care if it's not your passion, but there has to be a kernel of interest. Why are you doing it? Why'd you pick that over something else? Like, so even if it's not like a full-blown passion that somebody's like eyes light up and they're just like, this is what they were put on earth to do and they figured it out. That's okay, but again, you have to want to be there or want to do it or have some connection to it in some way. The other thing I always tell students is that this is a short, long-term project, or perhaps a long, short-term project. You can do this and realize when this process is over, or even a little bit before it's fully over, that this was a great run, and it was great while it lasted, but now on to bigger and better things. You may also be a student where you've realized, oh my God, I found my thing, and let's get on the rocket ship and go right from here. Both are great, right? Students, though, shouldn't feel like whatever they pick, that suddenly like they're locking themselves into this for a true long term. It doesn't have to exist in college. It certainly doesn't have to exist in your career. It's for now. This is what you're focusing on for now. And whether or not for now becomes for long, who cares? We'll figure that out when we get there. So no pressure on that part, but you do need to do something you actually care about.
Bari, what do you and how do you perceive the impact of AI on the application process?
This is a great question, and there's some very relevant current things going on. So we know University of North Carolina, UNC Chapel Hill uses AI in their initial like kind of brush through applications. Something this year that the University of Michigan changed for their honors college, they changed their essay question. And it literally, so I actually think, I mean, I'm such a nerd about this stuff, but I think it's so their prompt is to ask AI why the University of Michigan honors program is right for me, and to have it write an essay. And then you have to give Michigan that AI generated essay. And then your essay is about why the AI essay didn't capture and didn't quite grasp, like why it wasn't good enough, like essentially. And so they're kind of getting ahead of you. And so I think that is very smart of them. And I think it will be interesting to see how other schools handle it. So so AI is coming in, obviously part of the admissions process, sometimes on the back end for some initial, kind of, looking at applications. And then for students, on the student side, you got to be really careful. The other thing we were joking about is like, you know, when you have all these applicants, tens of thousands or even thousands, whatever, of applicants asking their chat GPT or whatever the same question over and over again, even when you kind of make it a little bit more to your liking, you have to assume that there's going to be something lost there. So we'll also start seeing, certainly in the, you know, kind of the check boxes at the end, as we already have, that this is work that was done completely by you. There are some other colleges that have said, listen, we understand that kids might initially start with some ideas there, but they're absolutely running it through AI checkers on the other end. And we've certainly, I know from, not from our students, of course, but from like my professional listservs, colleagues who have had kids get flagged for AI, even getting threatened to be, not just get that offer taken away, but to get other colleges notified. And so you got to be really, really careful and understand what each of your colleges considers. But the best thing to do is to just do the work as it always was before we had ChatGPT and things like that. Have somebody help you who understands the admissions process, who can guide you and direct you, and then you don't have to worry about anything at all.
I'm sensitive to the fact that I have a couple more questions that I'm happy to go through. And I know these questions came from parents, or we can look at some of the questions that came through. And I look to you and Sasha, because I'm happy to continue asking questions
I
unless
thought I
there
had
was.
answered a few of them just like quickly, some of the sort of low hanging fruit. And obviously some of the more specific questions, I think are always best for conversations with me and with Barry. You know, and you can always email me to talk about those. So I think, and Barry, you can take a glance at the questions too, and maybe there's some in there. You know, I know there are some questions about like fit, a lot of questions about fit. How do you research, Barry, the fit of a school? How do you find out what it is they think is the fit? So that's the one I've seen like multiple times in different ways.
I'm happy to respond. You know, there's not something where it's like the old FIS guide and you go up and you look and are like fit, because they don't publish these things. I think the truth is also, some of it, I think these, like if you talk to an admissions officer, they might talk about these sorts of things. But for us, at least the way, and I can only speak from my own experience, is, you know, you see, this is our 21st year, you see over 21 years, like who they each take and who they say no to. And you see patterns of the types of students. And there's not like if you do this and you do that, and if you do this, then you're a fit for this school. Or if you do this versus that, you're going to be a better fit for that school. There is this is definitely an art and a science. And it's like, you know, setting two people up on a blind date. It's like a gut sense of the person, and in this instance, an institution, and kind of how well they'll gel together. But certainly, you know, to give something a little bit more specific, because I can't just give little pointers for each one. Some schools are looking for more intellectually creative thinkers. Some schools are looking for more like extroverted leaders. Others don't care either way about that. Others are looking for students who have kind of been a bit more proactive in their own learning and their communities. Others are looking for you know, students who are more interdisciplinary thinkers and putting that into practice. And, you know, there's like a million different things. And it's not just one thing for each place. And a big part of it, sometimes we know a lot of like, oh, you'd fit well here and here, but we're going to have a few places, right, where we think you fit. A lot of times it's like, let's see how this essay unfolds. And then we can be like, all right, this is X, right? Like, this is going to be great. You love these two schools, like here's the one, like, and by the way, the one that we choose may be the one that's harder to get into overall, but for you, it's going to be easier, because it often will go even into that. Like, let's see what we can get out of you in the essay and what's really coming out in it. And like I said, you know, we're not scared. We'll go for the harder one if you're a better fit, and it'll work out in your favor more likely than not. But you got to kind of see what's there. But the broader picture of like where students fit, like I often will be like, oh, I think you'd hate the kids there. I don't see you there at all. You know, and then you got to go see for yourself, of course, always.
Barry,
So.
what do you think about us both being a fit for Barnard in the end? The serendipity, a little coincidence there, but
Right. I know.
I
Who
don't
would
think
ever
it's
describe me as someone, very independent, and, sort of.
same. But here we are,
There are
20
some
years
things
later.
about us that never change and that we can't change. And I always say that too, is that, when we talk about fit, yeah, there are some things we'll focus a little bit more on this, even though it's not as important to you because we know they're going to like it, or, something else for another school because we know that'll play better there. And then there are certain things about all of us. We just are who we are. And some schools aren't gonna like me. I'm not intellectual. I think I'm really smart. I am really smart, but I'm not intellectual. I don't want to sit and talk about ideas all day. I want to get stuff done. So does University of Chicago find me particularly compelling? No, I actually think I'd really like it there, but it's going to be hard for me to get in because that's not me, right? And so I might really want to go there, but I'm not going to be a good fit. Again, I could be successful, do the work, get great grades, whatever. But that's not what it's about. So, you got to kind of think and be realistic about the things that you can kind of, adjust or kind of focus on and not focus on in the process of applying. And then the things about each of us that is just us and we can't change, and nor should we want to.
I think I'm going to wrap it up at this point, but because I know we can go on all evening, both you and Sasha, Barry and Sasha, you're so passionate and we could keep going for hours. And I'm sure the parents as well could keep going. But I know you both are available to anyone with specific questions. And as always, what a dynamic evening.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And thanks to everyone for joining us.
Thank you both. I love being a part of this, and we'll be back soon for more. So
Oh, yes,
email us
definitely.
those questions or save them up for the next time.
That's right.